Hi, welcome to this lecture revising the Marxist perspective on crime and deviance. I'm also going to look at the Neo-Marxist, the critical criminology perspective on crime and deviance in this lecture as well. And this is revision in preparation for end of year exams or assessments. Um, so just to get started, I thought I'd just kind of highlight how Marxism is kind of different to functionalism, because in terms of definitely the AQA exam board, they do like students to be able to kind of recognize where theories might criticize each other. Um, for example, official statistics, functionalists see them as being true when it comes to crime, but Marxists don't trust official statistics or the police who make the official statistics by arresting people, if you like, or the criminal justice system, which then sentences people. So they don't trust official statistics. They think they are incorrect and reflect unfair policing. They also would challenge the view that crime is caused by deviant norms and values. They would say, nope, crime is actually caused by what Gordon calls criminogenic capitalism. So capitalism itself creates crime because capitalism creates inequality in society, and capitalism also makes us incredibly greedy. So it's not deviant norms and values that just a few individuals have. They would argue we all have these deviant kind of norms and values around greed and wanting more material possessions. They also, like I mentioned in my previous lecture, they disagree with the media as a form of boundary maintenance because they say the media does not report on crime in a true way. It's not a true picture of what is going on. The media often ignores the crimes of the powerful and hides like the true victims of crime, such as the working class, such as workers perhaps being exploited and mistreated in the workplace. The media kind of ignores those types of crimes. So there is no like boundary maintenance kind of going on with the media, way the media reports on crime. Um, and also, finally, they would argue that the laws that are in place are not there to protect the masses. The laws are not a reflection of a value consensus that we all kind of agree with. They would say that actually the laws that are in place actually protect the interests of the ruling class mainly. Okay, so that's unfair law creation. The key thinkers within Marxism I'm going to touch on today in this are Marx himself, Frank Pierce, quite a bit, Chambliss, David Gordon, I've already mentioned, Lauren Snyder, Gramsci, and Taylor, Walton, and Young. Sort of Gramsci and Taylor, Walton, and Young, part of the Neo-Marxist critical criminology theory. At this point, if you want to pause the lecture and have a go at doing a knowledge splurge and seeing what you can remember about the Marxist perspective on crime based on those things I've mentioned to you, and then you could use the rest of the lecture to kind of fill in any gaps, any bits that you might have forgotten. Just continue to listen and perhaps make notes as you go. So, the Marxist, or sometimes I call it the traditional Marxist theory on crime, is separated into kind of four key areas. The first one is the idea that capitalism itself creates crime. It's criminogenic, and this is David Gordon's idea. Now, he pointed out that the bourgeoisie, they use advertising to put pressure on people into wanting material goods, to spend money. And I always use the example at Christmas time, quite often adverts for like kids' toys. The Bluey house was one big thing one year, and I felt like such an inadequate parent because I couldn't get that Bluey house. And according to this theory, one of the things I could have done, because the advertising was saying you must have the Bluey house to make your kids happy, could have gone out and stolen it. Those adverts, did they make me? They could have made me feel like I should have gone to steal it in order to kind of make my kids and myself happier. Um, but I didn't. Um, there's also Gordon points out that capitalism creates inequality. Okay, the workers are exploited. Their wages are kept incredibly low, which means people quite often cannot afford the goods they're told to consume, or even the goods they need to survive. So the other way that capitalism kind of creates inequality is by having high prices for goods, because that means that the rich get richer off the profit of those goods. And Gordon argues, therefore, crime becomes a rational response to capitalism because people need to steal in order to meet basic needs. And I use the example of baby formula. where babies up to the age of 1 need to be on formula or breast milk. And if the breast milk isn't an option, then they have to be on formula. Otherwise, they literally start to starve, and formula is incredibly expensive. So that is a good example to illustrate how people, because of poverty, will commit crime, because if they don't steal the formula, then their baby starts to starve. And it seems like a rational thing to do then, doesn't it? Gordon also pointed out that because of criminogenic capitalism, we're all socialized into these criminogenic values like jealousy, greed, materialism. Crime is therefore found across all classes. So Gordon can be used, and criminogenic capitalism be used to explain corporate and white collar crime. So the example of Bhopal, the terrible explosion in the factory in India, where they decided to turn off the coolant tank in order to kind of increase profits because they wanted to save money. But that then triggered a terrible chemical reaction when there was a leak, and thousands were killed. That was ultimately driven by greed, which is a criminogenic value, being greedy, capitalism's desire for profit, which the corporation put first. Kind of the evaluation of this particular point is that this kind of technically means that you sort of feel sorry for the criminal. You sort of feel sorry for the criminal, but Marxism actually ignores the victims of crime. So if people are stealing to survive, it kind of ignores who they're stealing from. And the new right and functionalists would actually say poverty actually motivates people to work harder. So poverty, instead of committing crime, they should just work harder in order to kind of be able to afford the resources they need in order to survive. Okay. The second element of traditional Marxist theory is that the media manipulates our view of crime. The media tends to over-report on working class street crime, on things like benefit cheats, for example. That kind of means that a lot of people get quite resentful of the working class, see them all as being quite criminal and as a problem. And then the media then under-reports on things like corporate crime or white collar crime, I should have put in there. What this does is it justifies harsher policing and harsher laws that target the working class. Okay, so some examples you might want to look at is the way that the media reported on Just Up Oil and their kind of protests, which were disruptive, but the media reporting just focused on the violence and disruption caused by Just Up Oil, but also the G20 protests, G20 anti-capitalist protests. None of them reported, the media didn't really report on their sort of anti-capitalist messages, or the both groups kind of pointing out the inequalities that are happening because of some of the capitalist practices that are happening around the globe. You can evaluate this argument by saying, actually, the media has reported on corporate crimes. One of the reasons we know about the VW emission scandal, where they just sort of cheated the system, they put something in their cars that would just cheat the emissions tests. So everybody bought these VW cars or vans thinking that they were actually not good for the environment, better for the environment. Turns out they weren't. VW would just put programming into their cars in order to kind of trick the test. But the media does report on that and has reported on that, hence we know about it. And we know they report on some of the high status tax avoiders, whether that's, I don't know, Jimmy Carr, for example, and others. The third element of the traditional Marxist theory on crime is the idea that law creation is unfair. And the fourth is that law enforcement is unfair. And now both of these are possible because of us being manipulated to see perhaps the working class as being problematic and maybe the ruling classes or the middle classes as being good, which is number two. So Frank Pierce talks a lot about law creation being unfair. And he highlights that actually all laws that are made benefit the ruling class. So, for example, even the NHS, which is an incredibly costly policy introduced after the Second World War, he argues things like the NHS, really, they do benefit the ruling class because they keep our workers healthy. The NHS also ensures higher levels of infant mortality, so more healthy births, which means that we have a larger, more healthy workforce. And even things like the welfare state, such as benefits, okay, they mean that people are less likely to start a revolution. Okay, they mean that people are less likely to start a revolution. So actually, Marxists are really, really critical of things like the welfare state because they have actually made it less likely that people will start a revolution. Um, And a lot of laws that are in place tend to focus on a lot of the laws that are in place tend to focus on the protection of private property more than people, whether that's shops, whether that's banning things like skateboarding, um, whether it's telling us that, the comparison between the sentencing for people who perhaps beat somebody up versus somebody who perhaps damages some private property is quite different. Sorry, my kids just wandered in. 1 second. There's also the laws like things like 0-hour contracts that have made it much easier to exploit workers in large companies, such as looked at the examples of Amazon and McDonald's, where 0-hour contracts mean that a worker might be called on to work maybe 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day for 1 week, and then the following week their hours might be cut to zero. And that's particularly problematic if workers are in bad working conditions. They might feel that and many of them did in the McDonald's case, felt that they couldn't complain about their working circumstances, the unsafe practices, the burns they were getting, because if they did complain, their hours just got cut. And that's something that 0-hour contracts enabled. However, there are arguably laws that have been introduced or laws that are going to be introduced that might be to the benefit of the valuation. So, for example, the current government is hoping to ban 0-hour contracts. There is a law going through at the moment to ban them, which arguably will protect workers much more. Okay, even though the big employers or employers would like to keep 0-hour contracts, the current government is looking to ban them. Finally, the idea that law enforcement is unfair. So this is very much unfair policing, and this is look at what Marxists argue that the police working class and minority communities much more harshly and ignore the crimes of the powerful. And what this does is it distorts official statistics. That's why we can't trust them. They show us that working class people commit more crime. And the middle class don't, but that's because the police are policing working class neighborhoods. Police are targeting and stopping and searching working class people more than middle class people. Some of the examples that we've looked at, you might want to refer to things like there was an asthma death in London due to illegal levels of pollution, and McDonald's workers exploitation. Okay, where the laws just weren't enforced. Like there were illegal levels of pollution in London. A young girl died from an asthma attack, an asthma condition, and the judge ruled it was because the law wasn't being enforced. And so the police perhaps weren't enforcing the laws that were in place. And you've also got the idea of McDonald's workers not being protected by the health and safety practices that should be in place. The law was just not being enforced was not being enforced in that context. A couple of the studies that you might want to remember here for unfair law enforcement. Lauren Snyder, she points out the losses from corporate crime are 20 times greater than street crime, and yet our resources are all orientated, not all, but quite often mostly orientated towards street crime. And William Chambliss points out that the criminal elite are quite often businessmen, legal officials, and even politicians, but the jails were filled with the poor and the powerless. And that's still, even though his research was in America, even though his research was 20, 30 years ago, probably more than that, sorry, 50 years ago, the jails are filled with the poor and the powerless. Okay, law enforcement is still very unfair. And for example, the Just Stop Oil protesters, they got 4 to 5 years in jail for causing like enormous traffic jams and disrupting people's working day. And I know there were problems associated with that, but that is an extreme punishment, okay? Where no, they didn't do anything violent to somebody else. They didn't hurt anyone else, if you like. The other thing to mention is that law enforcement is very unfair because when the ruling class or the rich do get caught, they can use their economic capital to avoid punishment. However, an evaluation is it's the government, okay? The government with a lead, for example, into the investigations into some of the high-level tax avoidance, such as of Amazon, Google, and Starbucks. Starbucks was the one that was found to be acting illegally. Amazon and Google, perhaps it was more immorally. They were kind of using legal loopholes to avoid and they still do, avoid paying the same level of tax as a corporation, perhaps more physically based in the UK, despite the fact they make a lot of money out of the UK. And Starbucks did eventually pay a quantity of that back. Okay, and the government did lead that investigation. Going on from Marxist theory, this kind of links to another unit on globalization, green, and state crime. When we talked about crimes of the powerful, which is a concept or an idea from Frank Pierce. Okay, so this is where I've always taught kind of these kind of topics. It's really useful, the stuff I'm about to go through, for questions on the role of globalization. So if you get a globalization question, this kind of stuff is going to be really, really useful as well. So, crimes of the powerful include things like white collar crime, corporate crime, state crime, green crime. Okay, so white collar crime is crime committed by an individual for their own benefit, and it can be against their employer or as an individual. So, for example, if you're an accountant, you might defraud your clients and take some of their money and put it in your own account. Now, when I taught this, I used the Qatar World Cup 2022, both the awarding of the World Cup to Qatar and also the building of the stadiums. I used those two elements of this case study to demonstrate green crime, state crime, crimes of the powerful. So, for example, in that context, the FIFA executives that accepted bribes from Qatar, okay, in those hotel rooms, the ones that accepted those bribes in order to vote for Qatar to host the World Cup, they were committing a white collar crime against arguably their employer, which is FIFA. They became richer. They accepted a bribe, okay, in order, and then they did not vote fairly, which ended in the World Cup 2022 being awarded to Qatar, which at the time was a bonkers choice because Qatar is a desert state. It had no football culture. It had no stadiums. And yet they won that vote, but from FIFA. And many would argue that was because of high level bribery and corruption within FIFA. Um, Another crime of the powerful is corporate crime. And now this is crime committed by a company, and that can be against their employees by exploiting them or mistreating them. It can be against customers by perhaps lying to them, selling them dodgy products, the environment, obviously through things like pollution, or the government, where they might avoid paying tax. So yeah, linking back to the kind of Qatar case study that we looked at, FIFA arguably acted in a corporately criminal way by refusing to investigate its own corruption and calling out the whistleblower. They made it almost impossible. They made it impossible for the whistleblower to come to FIFA to kind of tell them about the corruption. The other corporate crime in relation to this case study that I've forgotten to put on the slide was the companies that built the stadiums. It was a corporate crime, the way that they arguably kind of sort of recruited almost like a level of like slave migrant labor from much poorer countries. And then when those migrant laborers arrived in Qatar, kind of being guaranteed certain salaries, certain working conditions, certain jobs, they were then put into very unsafe, very hard working conditions, and a number of them died. A number of them were injured. So that arguably is the corporate crime of the companies that built the stadiums. I should have put that on the PowerPoint, sorry. More generally, corporate crime can be committed against shareholders, so the people who kind of perhaps own the company. That's financial fraud. Can be committed against corporate crime can be against workers through things like industrial manslaughter, where people are killed perhaps through the work that they do. That's such as Bhopal. It can be crimes against a customer, such as false advertising or faulty goods. So the VW emission scandal I talked about, the Fiat Pinto scandal, if you remember, where it was found that the location of the fuel tank at the rear of the car was incredibly dangerous because if a car crashed into the back of the Pinto, the car was more likely to explode. Instead of fixing the Pinto, the company decided they would just pay out when people were killed or harmed rather than fixing the car as a whole. So that's an argument, definitely a corporate crime. Well, actually, it wasn't a corporate crime because when the law got changed, they eventually did introduce a change. It's probably corporate irresponsibility and immorality. That's when you kind of need green crime to say actually what they did. Ford Pinto, which it was Ford, sorry, that was definitely a criminal activity, criminally harmful. Corporate crime can be against local communities, such as causing environmental harm, the Citarum River in Indonesia, and the terrible pollution that goes into that river from the textiles industry, with the river being warm, the river being hot, the river having lots of different coloured dyes in it, and the harm that's doing to the people who live in the slums that live off that water supply. And of course, corporate crime can be against the government in the form of tax evasion, where you might want to use the example of Starbucks that we've looked at. Um, Corporate crime often is not investigated very well. It's complex. There's what's known as a diffusion of responsibility, difficult to understand who is actually responsible for the corporate crime. Thinking about Bhopal, no one's ever found one person responsible for the turning off of the coolant tank. It's very difficult to gain access to staff within corporations or the records. Quite often, you need people like whistleblowers, you need people from inside to come out and tell you about what's going on. Um, but one of the problems with whistleblowers or a lack of whistleblowers is quite often NDAs are signed, which are non-disclosure agreements. So people, when they start to work for these companies, they sign these agreements as part of their employment contract. So when they do leave, and if they did tell anyone about some of the stuff going on, they themselves can be sued. Okay, so the example within Qatar, the Qatari kind of whistleblower who wanted to report on these bribes, she was then sued for like $1 million, which is one of the reasons why she withdrew her case, if you like. Um, Another type of crime of the powerful that Marxists are interested in is state crime. This is a crime committed by the government or a government official against the population or against the environment or for personal financial gain. So, linking to the Qatar case, the state crime. Some argue that the Qataris bribing FIFA official was a state crime, but I was like, well, actually, they didn't actually break their own state laws doing that, so that's not technically a state crime. Definitely immoral, but didn't actually break any laws. Not necessarily a state, and that is one of the problems of state crimes when the state acts criminally. They're the ones that create the laws, so there's nothing for them to break if they're doing it in the name of the state. Um, so what I would argue, perhaps in terms of Qatar, the fact that Qatar didn't investigate worker deaths on the stadium construction sites, that's arguably a state crime. They didn't do autopsies on any of the workers that got killed on the construction sites. They just said that's not our policy. So no one will ever officially know the cause for those deaths. Qatar claimed most of them were things like, being unwell, being too hot, rather than things like unsafe working circumstances. Other examples of state crime you might want to use, things like illegal wars, where wars are called based on misinformation or misleading, perhaps the public. Genocide, things like the Holocaust would be an example of state crime. Um, Another example, by the way, the Holocaust didn't actually break the law within Germany. The Holocaust was actually part of a policy of the German government, the Nazi government, sorry, I should say. So again, an issue with state crime. It doesn't always break the law, but obviously the Holocaust was a horrendous act, and it didn't actually break the laws of the nation that it was committed within. State sanctioned terrorism, where states will actually support terrorist groups or states will allow terrorist groups to train within their territory, being aware that they have ill intentions, perhaps other countries or other groups. You've got state torture, state assassination, things like the CIA illegal rendition program that we talked about, where they kidnapped suspects connected to 9/11 from countries that had signed the Convention on the Geneva Convention on Human Rights and took them to black sites, countries that like Libya, where they hadn't signed that convention, and the CIA then tortured those people in those other countries. Um, Definitely an illegal program, but backed by the American state with the knowledge of the UK government. Anyway, and the final one is green crime. So, green criminologists argue that sometimes there are state and corporate acts that should definitely be considered criminal, even if they don't break the law, which the state makes. So, that would kind of be useful when we look at the Holocaust, for example, didn't break the state law, but was obviously incredibly harmful. Um, but when that happens, you might want to use the what's known as demiology or semiology. which is the study of a harm in order to find something criminal. So semiologists argue that if something causes harm to people or the environment, then it should be considered criminal and it should be treated as such. And linking back to the Qatar case, so we looked at the kafala laws in Qatar that enabled the exploitation of workers. So you could argue that those kafala laws are an example of a green crime using semiology, because workers had to hand over their passports when they entered the country. Workers had to be linked to an employer, a construction company employer, which meant that they were easy to exploit and mistreat, because the minute they complained or the minute they tried to quit, the employer would withdraw their work visa. The workers were immediately then in the country illegally and could be arrested. Okay. Workers were not being paid. They couldn't complain about it because the employer would just threaten to remove their work visa, in which case they would be arrested. So the kafala laws made exploitation of workers extremely easy. Okay, the final one I want to talk to you about is the neo-Marxist view of crime, known as critical criminology, and within here is a fully social theory of deviance. Now, this combines elements of traditional Marxism with symbolic interactionism. So some of the key ideas uh, kind of come from Gramsci's idea that the aim of the state, the aim of the government, that I would also include the media, the state would use the media to do this, is to manage capitalism, particularly when it's suffering a crisis of hegemony. So, crisis in hegemony is when capitalism starts to lose its ideological dominance. So, people stop seeing, or sorry, people start to see the problems that capitalism creates. And the signs of that would be lots of protests, lots of strikes, lots of social unrest, or perhaps rioting, for example. Now, what the state will do is divert attention from the real problems of capitalism. So, say there's high unemployment, say there is an energy crisis, say there's a bills crisis, say there's a cost of living crisis, which are all things that have happened recently. What the state will do will be like, oh, right, we'll find a scapegoat so everybody can get angry at the scapegoat instead of worrying about the inequalities that capitalism, or instead of worrying about the problems that capitalism's created. People just get angry at the scapegoat. And they do this through using the media and the process of labeling. Now, Taylor, Walton, and Young came up with a fully social theory of deviance, which developed on this idea. So they agree that traditional Marxism was right, structures in society created inequality, and that makes crime much more likely. So yeah, poverty equals criminality. It makes it more likely. However, they also argue that there was an element of free will and choice. Not everyone does choose to commit crime, but others will choose to commit crime and they'll do it as a form of political motivation against the system, against capitalism, against inequality. And they might choose it as part of a redistribution of wealth, like robbing the rich to feed the poor. Now, according to Taylor, Walton, and Young, they said certain groups are targeted by the state, the media, and the police as scapegoats. So this is very much Gramsci's idea, in order to distract from the problems capitalism has created. And they'll do this through things like a moral panic. But what this does is it creates deviancy amplification. As the groups that are labeled or targeted by the moral panic and the increased policing, and they are othered and outsided, they end up being labeled by the police, but also the public at large. Unfortunately, this can trigger a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the group might think, well, you think I'm criminal, you keep treating me like I'm criminal, so I'm going to act criminally. Or they might end up having to commit crime as they can't get jobs legitimately because everyone in society, such as employers, say, nah, don't employ that group, don't employ them. They're dodgy, they're criminal, can't be trusted. And one of the best applications of this to kind of demonstrate the fully social theory of deviance, this kind of like idea that crime happens because groups are targeted as scapegoats, is Stuart Hall's Policing the Crisis. Now, he wrote about what happened to young black men in the 1970s, and he said that they were sort of targeted by a moral panic. Now, firstly, mugging was a survival strategy for some young black men, okay, but not all. But the media started to over-report on mugging. Okay, so mugging is when you rob someone in the streets and take their possessions. The media started to over-report on muggings where there were like black perpetrators. And what that did was led to public outcry, public horror. The police started to over-police the black community. You had a lot more conflict style of policing against the black community. Almost like the whole of young black male groups, all of them, they were all stereotyped as being criminal, even though it's just small groups that were doing this initially. So they were labeled negatively, they were denied jobs, they were outsided by society. Um, and everyone started blaming them for the problems in society instead of blaming capitalism for the significant unemployment that existed in the 1970s. And the other kind of benefit to capitalism is what this kind of stuff does is it divides the working class along ethnic lines. So it means even though black working class have got more in common with white working class than they do the ruling class, by dividing them by along ethnic lines, they're less likely to unite as workers and kind of do the revolution. Um, Similar to this was Paul Gilroy. He also explained black criminality in the 1970s and the violence in the streets, the riots, the violence kind of against the police and the violence against white fascists. He argued that that was all in reaction to racism and reaction to the violence from the police, reaction to violence from fascists. So he sort of saw black criminality around this time as a political act of resistance. So that's that idea of it being a choice. Black men were acting violently, they were rioting, they were protesting, they were being violent against white fascists in order to protect themselves, in order to kind of demand more equality, in order to kind of, as a form of resistance against a history of slavery and colonialism and oppression. Some contemporary examples to kind of demonstrate the fully social theory of deviance, this kind of idea of scapegoating, would be things like immigrants, kind of the idea that immigrants had taken our jobs. There's a small picture there on the right-hand side from the Brexit campaign. Lots of a huge queue of migrants queuing, made out to be like coming into the UK. That was not a queue, by the way, that was getting into the UK. But yeah, immigrants taking our jobs, which means everyone becomes angry at immigrants taking our jobs, immigrants taking our hospital appointments, instead of getting angry at the government for there being a huge economic downturn, perhaps getting angry at the government that they haven't invested in public services. There's not enough medical appointments, for example. So you get angry at immigrants instead. In America, Trump played a bit of a blinder, kind of demonizing Mexico or Latin Americans for being responsible for all the crime and drugs that happen within America. And again, that serves helps them get elected along populist lines, but also really does divide the working class in America along those ethnic lines. Some evaluation of the neo-Marxist view, however, is it is really useful compared to traditional Marxism, and it helps us understand the impact of the media on crime, okay, and actually how the media reporting and the way the police use conflict styles of policing can actually be made worse, okay. So it really is helpful for help us understand the impact of the media on crime. However, similar to traditional Marxism, the neo-Marxist view does ignore the victims of crime. Okay, the people who are being mugged, for example, within Stuart Hall's study, you feel sorry for the young black men, not the people, the victims. And there is an argument that both Hall and Gilroy, they don't actually help explain the initial black criminality, perhaps itself, that there was some black criminality initially. And the other big problem with the whole kind of like fully social theory of deviance is quite often crime is against other poor people. Whereas if you're doing it for the redistribution of wealth, you should be robbing the rich to feed the poor. But quite often the crime was against other working class people because, easier to victimize, live in high crime areas, for example. So some problems with that theory. Okay, well, thank you for listening to this run through on the Marxist and neo-Marxist view on crime. I hope it has been useful.